Hello, and welcome to Radio Socialist Olympia, the podcast of the Olympia chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. I'm Isaac Wagnitz. We're joined today by Michael Hines, president of United Food and Commercial Workers Local 367, which represents about 8,000 grocery and retail workers in the South Sound region. Longtime listeners of the show may remember our first conversation back in 2022, which focused on UFCW 367's last round of bargaining with the big grocery chains. So in fact, that makes Mike our first returning guest on RSO. Mike Hines, welcome back to the program.
Thanks, Isaac. It's great to be back. A lot has happened since our last interview, so I'm looking forward to this.
Awesome. So yeah, as you said, a lot has happened at Local 367 since you first joined us. First off, the union won a strong new 3-year contract with Safeway, Albertsons, and Kroger this last time around, which included the biggest pay increases members have gotten in a single contract for quite some time. The contract also addresses pay disparities that had previously existed between different departments in some of the stores. But since winning that contract, the local has faced both new challenges and new opportunities. To begin with, at the end of 2022 and start of 2023, when the current contract went into effect, Safeway tried to delay implementation of the agreed wage increases. And then some Kroger workers also saw problems getting the correct pay rates on time due to a technology issue. And it took a lot of pressure by the union, including members and staff going to the media to get those issues resolved. I was actually on the TV news for a second talking about that at one point. Can you tell us a little more about what happened there and how union members were able to win what they were owed?
Yeah, so we're getting right into the fight. Okay. And you know what, Isaac, before I sort of answer that question, I'd like to remind listeners, I mean, you said so in the introduction, who we represent, 8,000 members across 6 counties. Lately, I've been talking a lot to just comrades and people I'm working with, sort of reflecting on all the work that we've done. And it's pretty amazing to think that because I don't think your listeners know this, we have 17 full-time staff that work at the local. 8 of those came out of the membership. And then we have 3 members. It's what we call special project union reps. These are members who come out on lost time. And to think that we have 20 people working out of the local representing that many members and at the same time taking on all these fights is pretty amazing. And it's great for us, but it's also a reflection of the relationships that we've been building with groups like Olympia DSA and Tacoma DSA and the Central Labor Councils. There's no way we'd be able to do what we're doing without those collaborations.
Yeah, absolutely. What those folks are doing is real impressive.
Yeah. So yeah, it's true that Safeway contacted me almost immediately following ratification of the contract the last time around to inform us that there was going to be a delay in the implementation of the wage increases that we had just negotiated. The reason they gave us had something to do with system capacity and the fact that they had bargained several contracts that were kind of in a queue. We were part of a coalition back then. I think there were 7 or 8 local unions, mostly on the West Coast, and then the Colorado local 7 that had all bargained their contracts. We were part of a coalition, but we bargained separately. And we were the last to ratify a contract. We were the last ones to settle. And so, about 2 weeks after we ratified the contract, Safeway calls me and says, we can't implement these raises. We don't really have the system in place to get this done. There's all these other contracts. And I pretty much, after asking them how long are we talking about, they told me 6 months. I said that was unacceptable. There's no way that our members are waiting 6 months to see their wage increases, and they should have thought about that when we settled the agreement. So we immediately filed grievances. We were preparing to take action, and when I say that, I'm talking about going out in the stores, leafleting customers, getting the members fired up about this, and pretty much making this what we call an issue fight. They had already had some experience of us doing these sorts of actions. And they pretty much backed off completely and then notified me a few days later that the raises would be going into effect immediately. And what was great about that is there were many local unions that had ratified before us that did not see their wage increases for this isn't good for the workers, but it's a reflection of what action can do on our end. But they did not see their wage increases for many months.
Jeez.
And we got ours. And then looking at the Fred Meyer situation, that's a little bit different. But towards the end of the year, it was pretty rough at the end of 2022 because the employers had announced, Kroger and Safeway had announced that they were going to do a proposed merger. And I know we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, Kroger had switched over to a new timekeeping and payroll system, My Time and My Payroll, I believe it's called. And what ended up happening is it was a complete fiasco, a complete screw up. We had members not receive I'm not even talking about wage increases. Actually, I'm talking about just pay in general. We had someone not receive a paycheck for a month.
Yeah, I remember that. That was in my store, I believe.
I actually I was supposed to be in a trust meeting one day, and I called out and said, I'm not going to the trust meeting. These are where the employers meet with the union to talk about the health and welfare trust. I said, I'm going down and talking to our members who haven't been paid in a month. So I went down and interviewed that member myself, and it was a tear-jerking story. Her husband had diabetes and all sorts of health issues. They weren't able to get the medicine that he needed. And, what we ended up doing with all of these stories was putting them on social media and then running a full-on campaign where we did leafleting of the customers out in the stores and brought in the media. And at the time, I was trying to get a lot of other unions involved in this, and especially with the merger announcement. We wanted to tie it to how can they claim they want to merge and become bigger when they can't even make payroll? And so, but for whatever reason, a number of locals didn't want to really participate in it. And they had their reasons, but we went ahead and did it. And then the issues got fixed almost immediately. A lot of other local unions filed class action lawsuits, or directed their members, I should say, to attorneys to file class action lawsuits. I'm not a huge fan of those. I think the attorneys are the ones that make all the money in those cases, and there's usually not a lot of payoff at the end, and they can take several years to resolve. But we got the situation fixed almost immediately, so we were pretty proud of that.
Yeah, and that actually leads us neatly kind of into the next big issue that's facing grocery workers right now, which is that in spite of these pay increases that we got, the companies have now been cutting employee hours just across the board. And this has had pretty serious impacts both on workers' incomes and on the working conditions in the stores. The companies have made some rather questionable claims that these cuts are due to lower sales, but the stores are still busy and grocery chains are still bringing in massive profits. In your view, how is this impacting workers? How have we seen union members fighting back, and really how can, customers and community members help?
Yeah, I think the reduction of hours, in my opinion, it's the most egregious practice yet that we've seen these employers do. It's an all-out assault against the workers and retaliation for the last contract. I mean, we saw the biggest wage increases we had ever seen. We had $2 for journey persons in the first year, and then $1 after that. We had never seen increases like that. But even more important, we were able to get all of these rates in the what we call the outlying departments. I think we talked about this last time, but it was Starbucks and the fuel center and some of the other areas where people saw huge wage increases. So I think some in the fuel center saw as high as $9.50 an hour in that first year. And so for the company to turn around and start cutting hours, it's egregious, and it's been happening across the board. We have definitely started up a campaign. You may have seen the buttons out in the store where we're talking about skeleton crews, and they're really cool looking buttons that we have 3 different designs, and it shows skeletons and has some good verbiage on it, and they're pretty visual and large buttons.
Yeah.
And the members love them. I don't know which one you like the best, but I envision people sort of trading these buttons to each other, almost like trading cards.
Yeah, they're quite popular in my store, and it is a good conversation starter with customers too.
Yeah, definitely. And So that's the idea is to, and I know we're going to talk more about this as we go on, but our local is committed to running what we call issue fights. And these issue fights are going to build the muscle that we need when we head into bargaining in 2025. And guaranteed hours or some sort of strong scheduling language that prevents the employers from cutting hours like this is going to be probably the number one priority as we head into bargaining.
Excellent. And some, concern has also been raised that the understaffing has created or worsened safety issues in the stores. Can you talk a little bit about how that's manifested itself and how members are addressing it in their workplaces?
Yeah, we ran a campaign prior to and during the last negotiations on safety. We called it Work Safe, Shop Safe. And similar to the Hours campaign, we collected dozens of stories, recorded on video, and we shared them through social media channels from members who had been robbed or assaulted in their work site. We also leafleted the customers, and that resulted in threats of a lawsuit from the employers. They called me one day screaming at me. I had them on speakerphone, and I just told them that we had every right to collective action, concerted protected activity, that there was no language in the contract that said otherwise. But they were threatening to sue us, and they wanted us to stop. And I said, if you want us to stop, then you need to take us serious at the Master Safety Committee meetings, which happen quarterly, and address some of our concerns and our issues. And they did. They backed off. They took us more serious. There were some improvements that were made through the Master Safety Committee. So we took the videos down and we sort of put the campaign on hold. Now we're going back and looking again at safety. And we understand that even though there's been improvements, it's not enough, right? You know this, that there's still crime happening. There's assaults happening, and they haven't done a lot to address the more serious concerns. But we are looking at this again, and we do think it's going to be a main focus in the next negotiations along with the guaranteed hours.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, too, that gets me about that is, like, I remember somebody from another store telling a story about how, like, somebody, like, hit their head on something and they were, like, alone in the back and, like, nobody found them for a while because they were, like, there was nobody else around. I had a call recently where we talked with one of the organizers, and he was talking about, like, they had an 18-year-old kid with, like, the front of the store, like, entirely by herself. And they were like, did they leave you up here? He was like, yeah. Like, yeah, crazy.
Yeah, there's no question that staffing levels and safety go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
So that both of those combined are going to be a huge factor going forward.
So on that note, I mean, at least it seems to me it's probably safe to assume that there's some kind of connection between the issue of the hour cuts and these companies wanting to present a better financial image of themselves, since Kroger and Safeway Albertsons have been wanting to carry out a merger for some time. And really the possibility of this merger has been top of mind for many, if not all, of the UFCW locals around the country, giving the potential for, store closures and layoffs. Consumer advocacy groups have also voiced deep concern over the potential for even higher grocery prices set by what would effectively be a monopoly in many places throughout the country. Where do things stand currently with the proposed merger, and sort of how has UFCW been working to help prevent the merger, protect the interests of its members in the event it does go through? And once again, how can supporters out in the community help out?
Yeah, I'm proud to say we were one of the first UFCW locals to voice concerns of the proposed merger between these two chains. We initially had joined a no merger coalition, but since then we've taken this approach that it's best to be prepared for any outcome. And that outcome is really, Isaac, going to be determined by the courts. And I always felt it would end up in the courts. We spent a lot of money, a lot of time and resources as part of this no merger coalition. I think it helped. But at the end of the day, it was pretty evident that the FTC was going to oppose the merger. And Kroger made it clear early on, you might remember this, that if that was the case, that they would sue the FTC in court.
Yeah, I remember that.
So no matter what, it was going to end up in the courts. Now, 2 lawsuits have been filed that affects Washingtonians. One is by the FTC, of course, and another by our state attorney general's office. Pertaining to the FTC, an injunction hearing is scheduled for August 26th, and this will be very telling. I think the Seattle Times put out an article right away stating that their opinion was if the injunction is upheld, and you know what that means. It means the merger can't move forward, right, until it gets settled in the courts.
Right.
So if the injunction is upheld, then it was pretty unlikely that the merger would go through, period, that the companies probably aren't going to spend several years in court not being able to make any kind of movement, that they would probably just scrap the idea. But if the injunction is not upheld, then the reverse would probably be true, because that means that these companies, Kroger-Albertsons and C&S, which is the proposed buyer, that they could move forward, that they could enter into agreements, they could start, merging all of their product and technology, and separating out some of the divestiture stores over to C&S. And that would result in, or I should say that would be really hard to disentangle, right? I mean, once you're a few years down the road of something like that, it's unlikely that the courts are then going to say, no, you have to unravel all of that and go back to how you were 3 years ago. So that's kind of where we're at on that. But I feel like I've always taken this perspective. It's complex because early on, one of the things that was being put out there by researchers is that with that $4 billion dividend payment that was paid out to Albertson shareholders, you might remember that.
I remember that one too, yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of folks believe that destabilized Albertsons. So if the merger didn't go through, Albertsons was for sale no matter what. There was part of me wondering if that isn't even worse than the merger going through. At least if we're just looking at our members and how it impacts our members, which is what I have to do as a president of a local union.
Right.
And so, that could mean stores get closed, could create food deserts. It could cause non-union companies to come in and purchase some of these stores. And so the position we took all along is that we have to be ready to organize any stores that might become non-union and then try to get some kind of legislation or things passed to prevent a food desert. And we weren't able to do that. We're going to talk a little bit later about the SB 607, but the originally, though, as part of that was supposed to be something around food deserts. And so that's sort of the lay of the land early on. We did this. We have someone on staff that's really good with computers. It took Google Earth and created this map of our 6 counties that we represent in the jurisdiction, mapped out all of the stores in relation to one another. And then from looking at that, we were able to determine which stores we thought could be divested or closed. And so it was good to know that going in, and the technology that Colton built was very popular, and a lot of the unions, especially the ones down in California, started borrowing that from us, and he walked them through how to do that.
Oh, nice.
And so that's, right now we're sort of in a wait and hold pattern. We don't really know if it's going to move forward or not, and right now everything is sort of on hold. I know that they increased the amount of stores in the deal, but I don't think that's going to sway the FTC.
Right. So that does actually bring us nicely to the locals' advocacy in state-level legislation during this past session. The union set out a pretty ambitious set of legislative priorities for the last session, and some important bills were ultimately passed, although some others that we wanted did not. As you mentioned, the biggest priority was Senate Bill 6007, which set out to preserve jobs for current grocery workers in Washington in the event of a merger. 367 members testified at legislative hearings, met in person with lawmakers to push for passage of this bill, which we did eventually win, thankfully. The locals lobby day in February, where members met with their representatives to advocate for 6007, had a really strong turnout, which was, I think, certainly a contributing factor. Can you tell us in a little bit in more detail what measures 6007 puts in place? And then after that, what were some of the union's other priority bills that passed, and which ones did not?
Yeah, the two that come to mind are SB 607 and HB 1893, and I'll just speak on those two if that's okay.
Sure.
So SB 607, in its essence, provides at least some protections against job loss in the grocery industry as a result of a merger. What it means is that successor employers would be required to retain all employees for a period of 180 days, or if any layoffs do occur, and those layoffs would need to be for business needs, not just to try to lay people off and break the union, which is a common practice. But if there was a legitimate business concern that required layoffs, then they would have to retain workers based on seniority. It also honors the current collective bargaining agreements that are in place, if that's the case, and provides for just cause. And I think your listeners probably know what just cause is, but it pretty much says that no employee can be terminated except for just cause, and the burden of proof is on the employer. That's huge when the burden of proof is on them, because we win many more of those cases than we lose, just because they have to go in and explain why they did what they did, and they often can't do a good job of that. So, and it also provides for an evaluation at the end of the 180 days. So if the employee is proved to be satisfactory, then the employer's got to consider offering permanent employment, I should say, to that person. Again, we were hoping to get some sort of, legislation in there or language in there that would say that they couldn't create food deserts by closing stores. That was a really hard lift, and decisions had to be made to take that out. And that's just the way these bills work, as they move through the House and Senate. And then the one that did not go through is extremely unfortunate. That's HB 1893. This would provide unemployment benefits for striking workers. The fact that it didn't pass is really kind of a blow. I thought for a minute that we had a really good chance of pushing this over the line. It would have been a complete game changer for upcoming negotiations in 2025, and we fought really hard for it. Like you mentioned, we had members in Olympia testifying on both these bills. If you look at some of the literature and the Facebook posts from the Washington State Labor Council, who were supporting both of these bills and campaigning heavily for them, you'll see our members in many of those pictures. And I think we were even on the cover of The Stand. And so, it's unfortunate that last one didn't go through, but it does show what can happen, though, when we work together as a coalition to try to get measures passed that benefit the entire working class. And what often happens, too, is we find members that we didn't know about before that really want to get involved in this sort of thing, and you end up developing leaders out of it. So it was great. Yeah,
I met some people from other stores who I'd never really met before at the lobby day, which was cool. It's just the people who are really interested in that particular sort of thing. About 1893, I mean, that's definitely disappointing. At the same time, I couldn't help but wonder if, that some legislators were really reticent about passing that one because it would have shifted the balance of power just a little too much, because it would have been a lot easier for strikers to outlast an employer who was really engaged in nefarious practices if they could have that extra bit of financial support.
Right, but I think one thing that really excites me about it too is that the Washington State Labor Council was at the forefront of trying to get it pushed, and it's a very progressive proposal, right? Mm-hmm. And so that gives me a lot of faith in the leadership of the state council. I'm a big fan of April Sims and Sharika Carter. I think they're doing great work.
For sure. Going on to local level policy, though, 367 can also claim some really important wins on city level policy around housing. The local is one of the first members of the Tacoma for All coalition. A lot of our members, I'm sure, are familiar with that. And probably the leading one in terms of people power and financial support. That coalition late last year succeeded in passing a ballot initiative which established a fairly impressive set of tenant protections in the city, although I think there's some attempts to kind of water down enforcement of that, which maybe we could talk about later. But this success also inspired an Olympia for All effort, which the union also supported. The two campaigns were a bit different, though. In Tacoma, the city council's refusal to enact tenant protections on its own authority led to the ballot initiative effort, which was a long, tough fight against landlords and real estate investors who brought in a lot of outside money trying to defeat the measure. In Olympia, the city council enacted a set of tenant protections without too much of a fight, which was actually a bit of a surprise to some of us here, although I think a lot of us would argue that the recent win in Tacoma and also the fact that so many union people showed up to support the measure at that council meeting really influenced that. It's maybe a little weaker on eviction protection than we would have wanted, but in a lot of ways it's pretty good.
Yeah, and I was not surprised, actually, Isaac, because I do agree with you that I think part of it was the success in Tacoma really helped spur the success in Olympia. But we also have a friendlier city council.
That is true, yeah.
And this is the council that passed hazard pay several years ago.
True, yeah. Tacoma didn't want to do that, right?
Yeah.
So obviously, like, doing a whole retrospective analysis of the Tacoma for All campaign would be an entire long show by itself, and maybe I should do that at some point, but there's a lot of ground we want to cover today. And that being said, there are a few key questions about 367 involvement in that campaign that I think will interest our listeners, especially Olympia DSA members. First off, there's been growing collaboration between labor unions and DSA chapters in some areas in recent years, often around strikes and stuff. For instance, Portland DSA forged a strong relationship with BCTGM workers in their area during that union strike against Nabisco a couple of years ago. That's the bakers, confectioners, tobacco and grain millers, represent a lot of like commercial bakery workers. However, and maybe I missed something else obvious, but the Tacoma Tenants' Right Bill is kind of the first example I can readily call to mind where a union and a DSA chapter really went on the offensive together to get a law passed like this. From your perspective, looking back on that campaign, how did you see that broad community coalition coming together that put all that resources and people power behind the initiative? Sort of what made 367 and Tacoma DSA natural partners in leading that coalition?
Yeah, I'm proud of the fact that our executive board early on saw the potential of a project like the Tenant Bill of Rights and the positive impact it could have on our members as well as the greater working class, who are paying rent within the city of Tacoma. It was my real introduction to Tacoma DSA and Tacoma for All and the individuals that were behind all this. I'm not sure labor would have signed on to support it had 367 not been an early endorser, but we went all in, throwing our weight behind it, providing resources. I think what made UFCW 367 Tacoma's DSA natural partners in this was just that we have the same vision, the same sort of goals. One of the things that I realized after we negotiated that last contract, and especially with hours being cut, is it doesn't matter how much we get in wage increases for folks if these employers cut your hours and if the landlords raise the rent.
Yeah, right.
So it was pretty easy for us to get on board with what was being presented to us, and it was very early. Like, it was really just an idea, and there were parts of it that were somewhat abstract, But as I watched it kind of develop and grow, the e-board became more and more excited to support this, and I think more unions came on board after that.
So can you talk a little bit? I mean, I've heard some things about how after this was passed, there were sort of attempts to block it from being enforced, that like the city didn't really want to the city of Tacoma didn't really want to cooperate in that. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on with that?
Yeah, well, the enforcement side is not really what 367 is working on. We still support Tacoma for All. There's other projects that we're working on with them. They're engaged in our organizing school, and they but what they're doing right now is doing sort of the education piece. I think what they've realized is that if the city's not going to enforce these codes, then it's up to us to do it. So we do that through education, just like we do with our members.
Mm-hmm.
If we're going to enforce the contract, the members need to know what that contract says, and then we teach them how to enforce it in the work site. But if they're unable to do that, then we have to step in and use, the grievance process and other things. And in the case of Tacoma for All, that would be the courts, right? And so I know that Tacoma for All is sort of transforming themselves. I think they're becoming a membership organization. They're doing more fundraising to sort of, help with the enforcement piece and the educational piece. But just to be clear, though, I'm not in the middle of that. I think I don't want to reinvent the wheel, so I let the experts do what they do, and we focus on, our fight.
Oh, for sure. So on the note of 367 being in a leadership role, 367 has also recently been taking more active role in leadership of the labor movement in our area. Several of our members and staff now serve on the boards of the Pierce County and the Thurston Mason Lewis Central Labor Councils. You yourself also recently became a board member of the Washington State Labor Council. Can you talk just a little bit about how that came about and what you think our increasing sort of presence in that leadership means both for our members and for our strategic efforts?
Yeah, I know you've been to our office, Isaac. You're an executive board member. I know you made that clear on the last podcast interview that you and I did in the introduction. But, if anyone were to visit our office, there's a picture on the wall from the late 60s showing a former 367 president looking over blueprints of a new labor temple in Tacoma alongside the principal officer of the Pierce County Central Labor Council. This picture is extremely inspiring to me. It's a reminder of the influence that our local had in this region going back to 1934. And because of all the great work that we've done these past several years, we're receiving a lot of recognition from unions and organizations around the state and even around the country. So it's an honor for me to serve as an executive VP of the State Labor Council. I was sworn in last month. As I just mentioned earlier, I think April Sims and Sharika Carter have a bold vision to raise the standards for the working class, same as we do. And they also have a commitment to organizing the same as we do. So it's just an honor. And I think it will help expand our influence and help all working class in the 6 counties that we represent. And then we also have 4 staff or officers, one on the Pierce County Central Labor Council on the executive board, and then 3 that are on the Mason Lewis Thurston CLC. And again, I think that bodes well for the future of our movement and of our local.
Excellent. Yeah, it's exciting stuff. And the people who from 367 who represent us down here are really great. There's folks I've worked with pretty closely before. So bringing it kind of back around now to issues and campaigns that 367 has dealt with in the stores. Since we talked last, the general merchandise sections in several Fred Meyer stores had organizing drives and voted to join the union. They'd previously not been union. For our listeners, general merchandise, or GM for short, refers to workers in these stores who don't handle food. For instance, the clothing, housewares, electronics departments, as opposed to the cashiers and the shelf stockers and produce, deli, bakery, etc. So for context, how did the situation originally arise where the workers handling food were unionized, but those in non-food departments were not?
So I can't say for sure why these groups are not part of the original organizing drives. These took place 25 and 30 years ago, but I can guess though what the issue was, and it was probably that these units are divided under the guidelines of the National Labor Relations Act. If you look at NLRB organizing and what constitutes separate units or different units, you can go in and organize, because I was an organizer for many years, and I would go into stores over in Eastern Washington. Like we had one store I was organizing in Sunnyside, if you know where that is, and There was a small grocery store with a meat department. And I was able to get, there were 2 stores actually, and I was able to get the grocery and the meat in 2 of the stores, but not grocery in one of them. So, but you're able to sort of carve out even meat departments from grocery workers. So my guess is that many, many years ago when they organized these stores, there was a strong interest in grocery. There wasn't an interest on the non-food retail side, and they made a decision at that point not to organize them. But the issue with that, though, is that what happened over the last 25 years, right? They could have gone in and tried to organize these stores, and for whatever reason, that never happened. So I made it a priority when I took over the local. When I got there in 2019, we had these 3 non-union areas, and this was Sumner, Tumwater, and Lacey. And then we had 5 clickless stores that were, or units, that were spread out. And then we also recently had a new store come into Gig Harbor, a metropolitan market. All of those became a priority to organize and get signed up. And so we went out, we did that. The company ran, and I'm talking about Fred Meyer, ran a huge campaign against us in all of these stores, including Sumner, which never should have been the case, because at Sumner we have what's called accretion language. We already have a contract in place for general merchandise in Pierce County. There's language in there that says any units that end up signing up for the union are automatically brought into that contract. And that also means that there should be a neutrality agreement in place where they're not running a campaign. We can just go in and sign these people up. They ran a full-on campaign. They did captive audience meetings. We fought with them over this. I think we filed board charges. We finally, after we signed everyone up and they refused to recognize, we leafleted the store to let people know we were going to do an action at the store. So it was sort of a pre-leaflet that, hey, here's what we're going to do. And the company flinched and immediately recognized that group and put them into the Pierce County agreement. But with the other 2, though, after we organized them, they refused to put them in the same contract. So we had to bargain 2 separate contracts for Lacey and Tumwater, with the thought that we're better, stronger together, right? So when bargaining comes up next year, what we put on the table is that we want all the GM put in, not just in a single contract together, but also in the grocery agreements. So that, the ultimate goal is that they make the same as grocery workers. They're working in the same stores. They're doing a lot of similar work. And the company just wants to divide and conquer, and we're going to keep pushing forward until we get everybody in the same contract.
Yeah, it seemed to me that, at least at my store, certainly, that it was really the sort of worsening work conditions during the COVID-19 pandemic really played a part in making those folks want to unionize, right? Because they were for sure getting taken advantage of in that whole sort of atmosphere of trying to just squeeze more out of less workers all the time. And it definitely highlighted for them, I think, the protections that union workers had versus non-union. I mean, do you think that that's a pretty fair assessment?
Yeah, I do too. And I also think it's the work we've been doing, because the non-union side of the stores have been seeing these campaigns that we've been running around safety and all sorts of things, and buttons, and the contract campaign from a few years ago. And they've often over time asked us, hey, can I have a button? Can I do this or that? And so I think you're right. I think the pandemic sort of shifted everything, made them realize they need those protections and added benefits. And then they're also excited about what we're doing.
Yeah, I was just a note. I mean, when the GM in Tumwater at my store was unionizing, it seemed I did a little bit of like I was a gopher for the organizer at the time, like talking to folks. And it seemed like we inoculated really well with like the captive audience, because like everyone who came out of them was like, that was the most pathetic thing I've ever seen. It was really great. Like nobody was swayed by him, right. Which made me just feel really smug. But also on that note, I should have mentioned that when we talked about the legislative thing, there is, I believe, a law in Washington now that makes it so your employer can't make you go to captive audience at all. You can just be like, no. which is a really great win.
That's correct, and it was really spurred by the National Labor Relations Board.
Yeah. So one last question on that point is that now that some of these stores are wall to wall, as the term goes, meaning like, you know, everyone or pretty much everyone in them is union. How does that really like strengthen our position in future bargaining and so forth?
Well, it strengthens it just by adding numbers, right? I think we're talking about, you know, if you look at 3 stores, there's 60 in the stores, so that adds about 180 or more, maybe just over 200 new members. And then more than that, if you count the click list, the 5 click lists that we organized.
For reference for the listeners, click list is the thing in Fred Meyer where it's like you order your groceries online ahead of time and somebody like pulls them for you off the shelf and then you go pick them up.
Right. And these are fairly good sized units, right? I mean, there's used to be where you had like 20 or 30 people in there. Now I think you can have as many as 50 in some of the bigger stores.
Yeah, they're the most chronically understaffed sometimes too. I know that's a constant problem in my store. They like run those people ragged.
Yeah, it's a hard job, and it's, you know, there's safety concerns that we've been fighting with the employers over. So it's definitely a group that needs to be unionized and have some added protections. But going back to your question, though, it strengthens the overall unit because you have more people. It especially strengthens the general merchandise unit, which was fairly small and has been treated like a redheaded stepchild. No offense to any redheads out there, but the employers have never treated them with respect the way they do grocery, if you can call the way they treat grocery respectful. And, they've gotten the short end of the stick for many years. Shoppers go through these stores, and if the lines are busy, they'll take their groceries over to the non-food side. But yet those checkers make several dollars an hour less than the grocery side. So this will strengthen them. Hopefully, this will be the first test. This negotiation's coming up. Are they going to take us more serious on the GM side now that we have more numbers over there? And we're definitely going to make a hard push. But I think it's going to benefit everyone.
Yeah, for sure. And so, although grocery store workers are obviously the large majority of 367's membership, we also represent some different types of workplaces. For instance, in Pierce County, we represent employees of some Macy's stores. 367 members at Macy's were recently in a pretty contentious contract fight with their employer where there, for a minute, looked like to be an actual possibility of a strike. Can you tell us a little about the background leading up to that? What were 367 members seeking in a contract that Macy's really didn't want to give them? And while the members did ultimately just recently ratify a new contract finally with Macy's in June, what did they win and how did they really overcome the opposition from the employer to achieve that?
Well, what the members wanted was better health coverage and higher wages, right? And not pennies, but, much more than that. And look, Macy's was difficult because the company's closing stores around the country and moving toward a different business model of operating small stores in strip malls. The local north of us has far more members than we do. They have several stores that are unionized. We do not. We just have the Tacoma Mall and the Tacoma Furniture Gallery, which is closing. But they represent a lot more up north. They took all of their members out on a ULP strike. And ultimately they settled the contract, and I don't really know all the details around it, but I think it was pretty similar to I think they got a little more than what they had before they went on strike, but I don't know if it was significant because this is a company that just they're not union friendly. They're pretty aggressive at the bargaining table, and they know their stores very well, and they're closing stores. So leverage is everything when you go into bargaining, and it's hard to have leverage when you don't represent a lot of people and the company can close the store, right? So you have to be creative in that case. So this is where strategy comes into play. We put 3 full-time staff on the campaign, which included our attorney. We launched Macy's for Power, which was a Facebook group. bargaining was contentious, but ultimately we were able to get very close to the same deal they got up north without taking our members out on strike. And I think it's because of our resourcefulness. What I like to use the term, what we lack in resources, we make up for in resourcefulness. And so being creative at the bargaining table and being militant out in the store with wearing buttons, doing car signs, etc., puts pressure on the employer. And, look, we're never afraid to strike. I think we always have to be strike ready, but you also have to understand your leverage points, right? And sometimes you need to push as far as you can without going on strike, and then sometimes you push all the way and you go out on strike. But it all depends on how strong you are. And I know we're going to talk about grocery bargaining next year coming up and what we're trying to do in that case. But with Macy's, it's just a challenge because of the situation, right?
Yeah. So last thing before we sort of go to upcoming or ongoing projects, I wanted to ask about the Franz bargaining too. So sort of at around the same time that the Macy's thing was going on, there were also 367 members working at the Franz bakery outlets in Pierce County who were campaigning for a new contract. Was that also a tough fight, or was the employer kind of more reasonable in this case? And again, sort of what were members asking for, and what did they win, or anything else kind of noteworthy about that?
Yeah, I think the goal with Franz was to move closer to grocery wages, which we were able to do, but it's never enough, right?
Yeah.
No matter how much we get. But Franz was similar to Macy's in a lot of ways, except that we coordinated this time with two other unions in securing a good contract. We did take a strike vote. It was less about our members, more about supporting another local that was more, their situation was different than ours, and we wanted to support them to make sure that they received the same wage increases. So we took a strike vote in solidarity. And ultimately, we got a great deal for everybody. What's great about both Macy's and Franz is that we have member leaders that came out of those campaigns that I'm really excited about, and it's just going to help strengthen us going forward.
Excellent. All right, so just as there's been a lot that has happened since our last conversation, there are also a lot of new and ongoing projects that UFCW 367 is involved in. So let's turn now to some of those. Probably the most visible current effort is a drive by the local in collaboration with the local central labor councils to get Workers' Bill of Rights legislation passed at the city level in Tacoma and in Olympia. If passed, these measures would help ensure more predictable scheduling for workers in those cities, mandate safe staffing levels, at least for certain industries, and increase the local minimum wage. Are there any other provisions of those proposed measures that you'd like to talk about or that I missed?
Well, safety is something that we're revisiting from the last negotiations. I mentioned that earlier. Although we've made some improvements, there's a few key areas that we want to explore. And one of those is panic buttons in the fuel stations at grocery stores and maybe other locations where it might be needed. The other is mandated active shooter drills. We have been fighting with the employer over both of those issues, and it's time to pass some kind of legislation that holds them accountable. I've been in some of these master safety committees, Isaac, where when I bring up active shooter drills, the employers have literally rolled their eyes at me and said, "What, we have to show people where exits are?"
Seriously, that was what they... Jeez.
Yeah, and I, of course, said, yeah. That's exactly what I'm talking about, because especially when you have, now that we have the all-purpose clerk, which we didn't really explain that to the listeners, but we have this new classification in the contract where people can be trained and float into these different areas, supposedly to get hours. Well, if I've never worked over in ClickList and I'm now over there training, yeah, I think I should be trained of overall exits and strategies in the store in case of an active shooter. And so I've been talking to Steve Conway in Olympia about this. He thinks that L&I would support us on these sorts of measures. They're not unreasonable by.
He's a legislator, by the way, Steve Conway, who's been very supportive of us in the past. What district does he represent again? It's up in Tacoma.
Yeah, he's, don't ask me districts. I always get
that's
them.
Fine. Never keep them straight either.
Yeah.
So the timing of this campaign also corresponds to the buildup toward 367 next round of bargaining with the big grocery chains, which we'll discuss in more depth in a little bit. For now, sort of how do you see this campaign really aligning with or supporting the locals' effort to win a strong contract? I mean, you mentioned the getting safety stuff actually legally mandated, but is there anything else?
Yeah, the goal of this campaign and really the Worker Bill of Rights and all the different things that we're working on is, and maybe I should start by sort of explaining some history. I think it would be helpful to do that. But there's a very long history of this local union bargaining with the local north of us, which is Local 3000. That's good because there's always strength in numbers, and there's been a lot of ways that has benefited us over the years. But one of the ways it hasn't, and this is really the employer driving this, is that the employer looks at us. They're much bigger than us up north. They're 55,000 members, or we're 8,000 members. So the employer just wants to bargain with them and then give us a contract and say, go ahead and sign this. Well, the problem with that is we have our own issues. We're not Seattle. We're not other areas. We're the 6 counties that we represent, and our issues are unique, just like any other union around the country. So last time when we went into bargaining, we pushed hard on safety. We understood sort of the history and the lay of the land, the way things usually work, and I was the new president at the time. And I came out of that local up north, by the way, going way back to the 90s when it was Local 1001, and I organized my own hospital. So I have a long history and a lot of friends that work at that local. But, I explained to the employer, look, it's great. I know that a lot of what we get here is the same as what is up north, but we have these other issues that we need to talk about. One of them is safety, and we're going to show you some videos of stories of members of ours being assaulted and why safety is a priority down here. They were very upset by that. They didn't want to have to watch these videos, and I made them do it anyway. And then at one point, they pulled me out in the hall and said, look, if you want to bargain separately, we'll tear up the agreement we just did up north, and we'll bargain with you county by county. We don't think Grays Harbor should make what Tacoma makes. We don't think Tacoma should make what Seattle makes. Part of that's a bluff. I understand that, but there's a little bit of truth to that too, if they really wanted to come after us. And at that time, we were the last union to settle. Everyone else in the coalition had settled. And I talked earlier about leverage, right? Mm-hmm. And we had a recession breathing down our neck, and we had more money on the table than we'd ever seen in the history of our local. So I had to explain to the bargaining team, our job is to lead the membership and lead this local, but not to lead them off a cliff, right? So we have to, so we pushed back as hard as we could on those issues, but we also had to make compromises that I wasn't really happy about. And I shouldn't say they were terrible compromises, but we wanted more in the way of safety than what we got. And so that's sort of the history. Now we're going to bargain with them, and we're much stronger, and we'll explain why momentarily, but we're in a much better position to fight for our own, get what we really want in our contracts, but we also recognize the employer may try to come after us on that. So trying to pass legislation in both Tacoma and Olympia, and hopefully by doing that, it will expand outside of those 2 cities, but by focusing on the 2 biggest cities in our jurisdiction, if the employers know that we're pushing for this legislation that's going to mandate active shooter drills, panic buttons, fair scheduling, and all these other things, then they're going to take us more serious at the table, not screw around, and probably even try to bargain language rather than have it mandated to them, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
There's this thing called carve-outs that employers are used to. It's just a reality that most legislation that's passed does have a carve-out for collective bargaining agreements. And if the employers are smart, they're going to look at that and say, okay, we're better off to bargain our own language than to have the state mandate it to us.
I gotcha.
So that's the whole goal in the strategy as we head into negotiations early next year.
So there's also 2 planned kickoff events for these campaigns, for this campaign in July, one in Olympia on Saturday the 20th and the other in Tacoma on the 27th, which we're calling Workers' Rights Summits. And we'll include links to info and registration for those in the show notes. What can you tell us at this point about the agenda and goals for those summits and why anyone who's a worker in those cities should attend and bring as many people as they can?
Yeah, sure. We're still finalizing the agenda, Isaac, but the idea is to have partners come together to host the event. Right now in Olympia, I think we're in partnership with Olympia DSA and with the Central Labor Council down there. In Tacoma, it's Tacoma for All, Tacoma DSA, the Pierce County Labor Council. But the idea is to come together. I think there's going to be tables and booths set up by each partner, which will have educational materials and resources. People can sign up for volunteer opportunities. A good example is DSA's Strike Ready, that I'm sure all of your listeners know what that is, and people would be able to sign up for this. We're going to have a panel of workers talk about the importance of a worker bill of rights. They're not just going to be union workers, but from non-union as well. And then I think there will be a community panel that will also show some form of support or something of that magnitude. It's really just the beginning, but I think it's going to be great. And the more turnout we get, the better. It's really just a launch of the bigger launch, which will take place early next year, probably in January, as part of our leadership conference, when we really have a full fleshed out initiative to put on the ballots and we start the signature gathering process. But we really want people's input now as to what's important to them and what we should be fighting for.
Yeah, and on that note, Olympia DSA members listening should also know our chapter did recently endorse the summit on July 20th, and we're officially urging members to attend and encourage others to do so. Related to that, Mike, how do you think DSA can best support the effort to win that Workers' Bill of Rights here in Olympia?
I think whatever you did to help move the tenant rights protections is a great start. This is an opportunity for all of us to collectively make history together. I don't think anything of this magnitude's really been done, at least the way we envision it. And we're going to need to raise an army of volunteers and signature gatherers to push this over the line. And, one of the challenges down in Olympia versus Tacoma is there's a much higher threshold of signatures that are required to put initiatives on a ballot. And so, if that's the road we're going to take, if the city council doesn't just put something on the books like they did for the tenant rights, then we're going to have to get people to volunteer to go out and get signatures. And I think that's the best way that Olympia DSA can support this.
Absolutely. So speaking of cooperative efforts, 367 also recently launched the South Sound Organizing School in collaboration with Tacoma DSA. And this program aims to teach the basics of workplace organizing to members of unions and community organizations. This organizing school had its first cohort start on May 29th, I believe it was, in Tacoma, and there are plans for future sessions, including in Olympia. I recall you mentioning that the curriculum is largely based on Jane McAlevy's Organizing for Power trainings, but for those who aren't familiar, can you tell us a little bit about what the students will be learning? What are some of the longer term goals for providing this kind of training, and as well as maybe when you think we could see a cohort start in Olympia?
Yeah, this is a passion project of mine. I'm excited to finally see it come to fruition. I think I first envisioned an organizing school back in 1999 when I was over in Eastern Washington organizing, and I was pretty green and had only won a couple of campaigns, so I don't think I was qualified to launch a school, but wanted to, just because I see the importance of training people to be organizers. And right now, when I look at South Puget Sound, there is a lack of experienced organizers living in our area. Most people that move from out of state want to move to Seattle.
Mm-hmm.
They want to move to the bigger cities. We have run ads for organizers, and it's very hard to find the right organizer. So then I started thinking, well, why don't we just create our own school and develop organizers, and then out of the school we can identify those that we think have what it takes, and maybe hire them or put them on projects. So this first round, you mentioned Jane McAlevey. For your listeners, I don't know if they all know who she is, but McAlevey she's a professor at Berkeley in labor studies. She's written several books. She's a real boots on the ground, rank and file, bottom up, grassroots kind of organizer. Started her career as a community organizer with SEIU, and then moved into traditional organizing, and then really building power in negotiations through big open bargains and community organizing from the bottom up through the rank and file, which to me is very unique. Most of the time when we run contract campaigns, we have what we call the air war. We go out and we find these churches and these pastors and these community groups that are going to support our efforts. What Jane does is go in and talk to her bargaining team, and they start mapping out their community and their network. She wants to know, where do you go to church? What politicians do you know, right? And then that's just much more powerful than just hiring a priest to come in and speak at a rally. And so, unfortunately, I should back up for a second. I reached out to her a year ago and asked her to be at our leadership conference that took place in March of last year. Mm-hmm. She's extremely busy. She had just come off a sabbatical, writing a new book. It was just coming out at that time. I didn't even know if she'd pick up my call, to be honest with you. And she did, and we talked, and we hit it off great, and she was our keynote speaker. So she's been a huge influence on our local and the bargaining strategy we have going into next year. Unfortunately, she just entered hospice. She's been battling an aggressive form of cancer for quite some time, and we had already put the first agenda together for the 8 weeks of our organizing school. It's an 8-week course. It's 2 hours, 1 day a week. So it's a commitment for people to go to. It's not virtual, it's in person. Mm. We had already put it together, and then when the news came that she entered hospice, I decided to dedicate the first 8 weeks to her, and we changed up the curriculum just a little bit. So in one of the modules, we're going to be playing her keynote address for the students, and then and that's in week 7, and then in week 8, which is the final one where people graduate and get a certificate, we're going to just sort of have a roundtable discussion about Jane's strategies and concepts and how they can be applied in the work that we do every day. But my ultimate goal and vision for the organizing school is that it changes and grows organically. I want to bring in different people. In this course, in the first module where I did an introduction on the member-driven model that we use at 367, I brought in a Teamster who recently retired after 40 years. His name is Leonard Smith. He just received a Lifetime Achievement Award from MLK Labor. Leonard is someone who not only has been an organizer for all those years, but at one point worked out at the George Meany Center, which is no longer around, but it was a graduate school for labor studies, really. And he worked for them, and they sent him to Eastern Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall. And he taught organizing concepts and principles there. I'm going to be meeting with him coming up here in the next couple weeks to get him more involved in the school. I'd like him to teach some of the classes. But I want this to just grow. I want different people to come in. The curriculum will change based on whatever's happening at the time. Maybe there's a big battle like the Tenant Bill of Rights that happened recently, and maybe there's a way that we can use some of these campaigns to plug people in so they're not just in a classroom, but they're actually almost like an apprenticeship working on these programs. And so I'm super excited about it. I don't think I've ever been as excited about a project as I am with this. And yes, we're going to move it to Olympia the next round. And that round will be very similar to this round as far as dedicating it to McAlevey and having her presentation, all that. And then when we move it back to Tacoma for the third group, it will probably be a different overall curriculum where different people come in and teach. And so, yeah, I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, and should mention, of course, again, Jane McAlevey's just been hugely influential for, I think, a lot of people in DSA and in the labor movement in terms of all the strategies and approaches that she's brought to that and all the work that she's done.
Yeah.
So this is a little bit of a digression, so I'll try to keep it brief. But I wanted to talk for a second about how much I find it really encouraging to see the way that our local 367 has taken the initiative, to partner with other unions and organizations, including DSA, to do things like pass these pro-worker laws, train people in organizing. Obviously, as a member of 367 myself, I'm really pleased to see what we've accomplished so far, and I'm really optimistic about what we can achieve in the near future for our own members and just for the working class more broadly. And as a member of DSA, I'm also really excited to see working class people coming together and acting as a political force in this way, organizing to win these improvements in their own lives. And I see it as the beginning, at least, of something that's potentially game changing, which is like a working class movement that builds power both on the shop floor and in the realm of politics and legislation. Although this has also sort of long been an elusive dream in American politics, right? I'm just sort of curious. I mean, do you see what do you see as the potential here? Do you think we really have the opportunity to begin shifting the political dynamic in favor of workers, at least, in our jurisdiction or maybe at the state level?
I do. I think there's been a shift, and rightly so towards local politics instead of on the national level. My hope is that we continue to build real relationships and coalitions rather than the old model of transactions. I'll give you one example. Jamaica Scott ran for city council down in Tacoma this last round, and she was sort of an underdog. We had endorsed her early on. We have a good relationship with her. She's doing great work in the Hilltop neighborhood as a community organizer and as an artist. But, there were some organizations that didn't support her, and it got to a point where there were some other candidates that were put on the books by bigger, larger unions, and it got dropped on my desk. I was asked by one of our organizers, are we going to continue to endorse Jamaica? And I said, well, why wouldn't we? And they said, well, because these other bigger unions are pushing someone else. And I said, yeah, we're not going to treat our partners that way. If we lose, we lose, but we're going to support her. That's our candidate, and we're going to help her get elected. And we did. And it was a fight, and I'm pretty proud of the work we did to get her elected. But, we need to be good partners. We need to learn how to start putting aside our differences and focusing on issues instead of politics and other matters. And that's how we're going to bring back civil discourse. Our own membership is a great place to experiment with this idea, Isaac, because they're very much divided like the rest of the country is politically. And we're not going to change anything by telling people they're wrong and arguing with them. We need to find common ground. And that's why we look at issue fights. And we've been able to get members of ours who are very far right wing politically to support the Tenant Bill of Rights and to support candidates like Jamaica Scott because we focus on the issues.
Yeah, and I agree with, I think, like sort of the tendency that I'm part of in DSA, right? We're kind of focused on that approach as well, where when you focus on these material issues that are of broad interest to working class people, you can bring people together around a shared vision that also kind of broadens their view of their position as workers, right? I mean, I saw that with like the Tacoma for All thing. Like I expected there to be opposition to us doing that kind of legislation or of partnering with DSA, and I really didn't see any because I think so many people just saw that it was in their self-interest as workers to support this kind of legislation. And
Yeah,
similarly with our,
exactly.
yeah, oh,
Oh,
go on. I'm sorry.
oh, I'm sorry. Exactly. We have a couple members on our executive board who, again, are politically right wing, but one of them was following around. There was a guy that was driving around taking our signs out of the ground for the tenant rights. There were also swastikas being painted on some of the signs. It was a
Yeah, that
pretty
was wild.
nasty. Yeah, it was a nasty campaign, but she happened to be out driving around with her kids and sees this guy pulling our signs out of the ground. She starts following him, taking pictures, and
Love it.
sent those pictures off to Tacoma for All, which I think may have filed a lawsuit against. I
Hmm.
think the person may have been identified, but she was Facebooking me during that, and I was saying, hey, please be careful. You got your kids in the car, and of course she's not going to put her kids in danger. But this is someone who politically is not even close to being where I am, but yet saw the value in the tenant rights.
Yeah, and like at our lobby day too. I mean, there were members who showed up who I'm definitely wouldn't have agreed with about certain things, but like there was this one guy who like, man, he was really going after like his representative from like his district about like not wanting to not about her like not wanting to support 6007, and he was like giving her a hard time about it. It was great. I loved it.
Yeah, I know
Um,
who you're talking about.
yeah. So in our last interview, you talked about the idea of member-driven unions, right? Where the real initiative and energy come from members, and sort of contrasted that with models where the direction is primarily set by the staff, or where the union's activity is mainly confined to contract enforcement or lobbying. Since then, I've heard the term super servicing used in some of 367's internal conversations to convey sort of the idea of an approach which combines a very active membership with a very, highly trained staff who rigorously enforce the contracts and pursue new organizing. So where do you think things stand now with trying to strike that balance? And what do you think is kind of the main advantage of doing that best of both worlds approach? And have there really been any particular challenges in trying to realize that?
There's been a lot of challenges, primarily in the move to an organizing mindset at the local. So we've seen turnover of staff. We've seen pushback from a small but vocal part of the membership. And I think the thought is that if we focus on organizing and building power, we're abandoning the idea of representing the workers. And really nothing could be further from the truth. Maybe, Isaac, you could put the image of our member-driven model in the show notes so that people, I know I
Yeah, for
described it the
sure.
last time, but maybe give that to them so that they can see what that looks like. But we're committed to not only fierce enforcement of the contracts through legal and contractual methods, such as filing grievances, but we also organize around the issues in the worksite. So we do petitions, we wear buttons, we march on the boss, and whenever necessary, we'll leaflet customers, call in the media for coverage. And all of this is preparing us to be strike ready at the right time, when negotiations come around. And I want to be clear, because people going out on strike is kind of sexy right now, right? You have Sean Fain and UAW,
Oh yeah.
and you have all these things happening around the country. But the goal is not to strike. The goal is to be strike ready. It's the ultimate weapon that unions have to fight back against the employer. And you have to be strategic about it. If you look at the growth of unions back in the 30s and 40s, you can see the trend line going up dramatically and union density growing. And it was because of organizing, and it was because of being strike ready or taking strikes, as well as educating members in political work and all of that. We teach all of that in our class. But yeah, it has not come easy. There's a book I recently read, I don't recall the name right now, but it talks about adaptive change. And I think looking back on the last few years, if I had to really be truthful with myself, I think there's been a lot of change quickly. And the book was kind of saying, it's better to do adaptive change slowly over time. I have a friend that likes to use the term where I'm looking for an evolution, not a revolution, right? And I think in some ways our local has been revolutionized and growing at a quick pace, and with it comes a lot of criticism and pushback.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely true. There's always challenges. Although, I mean, for what it's worth, coming from me, as a member working in the stores, like it's great to see all this new organizing going on. But also, like I have not seen any diminishment in the contract enforcement, like at all. Like my rep
Right.
is in the store all the time. Shout out to Patty because she's great, and like the management in the store are like a little bit scared of her too, which is kind of great.
Love it.
On that note, though, in our previous interview, we discussed how the member driven model compares to the rank and file strategy that DSA laid out. Have your ideas evolved since then, or what do you see as the similarity or difference at this point?
I think they have evolved. When you and I did our interview last time, I was developing the member-driven approach. I don't think I fully realized how closely aligned with the rank and file strategy that it was. And it was our interview that caused me to sort of take a deeper dive into the literature around that. And over time, my ideas definitely have evolved. One of the things that I want to do in the next round, or the next round of the organizing school that ends up in Tacoma, followed by Olympia, is the first module to be sort of a comparison of the member-driven approach and the rank and file strategy, and have myself and a person from DSA together sort of teach that workshop. So we can show where these ideas align and where they might veer off in a different direction. But ultimately, they're very much similar. I would say probably the biggest growth idea or realization that's happened over these last couple of years is from reading McAlevy's books and reading about that militant minority. And that's what we're trying to build right now out in the stores. She defines an activist as someone that shows up, right? They're someone that wears the hat, wears the button, shows up to an event, but they're not necessarily organizing their coworkers, right? Mm-hmm. And you need people like that. And in fact, you need a lot of people like that. But you also need the ones that are going to organize their stores and their work sites and build power that way. So there's a difference between organizing and mobilizing. We organize new leaders in the stores, and then we mobilize the mass majority. And that's kind of what her concept is. And what we're trying to do now as we head into negotiations, we're building this militant minority in the stores. We're doing these member engagement teams around worksite issues and fights. And then the goal is to mobilize everybody else so that we have supermajority when the time comes, whether it's a strike, a ULP, petitions, whatever the case may be. And I know in a minute we're going to probably close up talking about grocery bargaining, and I'll talk a little more about how we're going to mobilize people. But to me, that's where the rank and file strategy and member driven are very much alike.
So we talked earlier about some new shops that have recently joined 367, but you've also expressed concern about a slight overall decline in the locals membership and have stressed the need to undertake new organizing campaigns. So first off, what do you think explains that drop in membership? I've been inclined to attribute it to people retiring and just not being replaced due to the company's cutting hours. And then sort of what do you see as the big organizing opportunities or imperatives for the local?
The biggest frustration for me, Isaac, is that with all the organizing that we're doing, all the work that we've done over these past couple of years, that we're still losing membership. The numbers have been dropping, not going up. And if I look at the history of our local, you can see decades where the membership kind of stayed around 7,500 members. And I always was sort of fascinated by that because the local, every president's different. And there were a lot of locals, especially in the 80s, that just didn't organize. But I always thought, how did they maintain their membership by not organizing? It never made any sense to me. And then someone pointed out, someone who's been around a very long time, who's somewhat of a mentor of mine, said, well, they were opening stores back then. All these years, they would open up new stores. These companies were growing and hiring more people. So even if you did lose a unit, you would gain another one. That's not the case anymore. We have food deserts in our area. There's been no stores that have opened up from Kroger or Albertsons in our jurisdiction since I've been on staff back in 2019. Met Market is the only real new store, and there was a Central Co-op that opened in Tacoma back in 18 or early 19. So I think you're right. I think they're not replacing people. They're cutting hours. They're not opening new stores. There's always that fear, like, of Macy's closing, or, the furniture gallery closed. So I've done the numbers on this. For us just to maintain our membership, we have to organize at least 5% to maintain those numbers. We have to organize 10% a year in order to grow our union. And the best way to do that is to expand into other core industries. There's still a few grocery stores out there that we can organize, but UFCW across the country represents meat packing and food processing, as well as non-food retail. Non-food retail can be a pretty tough business because of internet shopping, and there's always that danger of these retail stores closing. Look at what's happening with Bartell's and Rite Aid, and Macy's and other companies. But that doesn't mean we won't continue to try. There's a REI campaign happening around the country. We ourselves have had, conversations with workers over on the retail side, the non-union retail side. There are some ongoing campaigns happening. But I think to really grow our union, we need to move into food processing because it's a little more stable. It's probably not going anywhere, and there's more workers in those locations.
Yeah, and there's some of those kind of workplaces in our area that I didn't even know existed, but there's opportunities there.
Right.
So I've heard, and I tend to agree with the argument that, having contracts in multiple different industries is important, since, the union can still be bringing in dues from some workplaces in the event that some others are on strike. However, how do you balance that with the need or to avoid possibly becoming too big? You know what I mean? Because I've known and talked with people that are in unions that are really big and have a lot of contracts and not very many reps, and inevitably someone sort of falls by the wayside. Is there a good way you see to balance that, or is there sort of like a magic number, as it were, of members or contracts for a local of our size?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a magic number, but I have noticed that local unions with anywhere from 17,000 to 24,000, they seem to have the resources necessary to run sophisticated organizing and contract campaigns, whether it be political or new organizing, whatever it might be, but still represent the membership and enforce those contracts. I have lots of friends that are presidents of 20,000 plus member locals, and the presidents are out in the stores talking to the workers.
Mm-hmm.
But when I look at local unions that are much bigger than that, you don't really see that. And then you start to see members feeling like they're not being represented. I see it all around. So, but you also never want to stop growing. So, what if you get to 24,000 members? Are you then going to tell people, well, we can't organize anymore? You're not going to do that. So I do have a theory on how I would do it if I was lucky enough to be able to organize that many workers, is that I would create satellite offices that really operate independently. Mm-hmm. They may all be part of the same local union, but they're not just offices that do the bidding of the big local mothership, but they actually run independently with a director. Everyone has to be in alignment with the overall vision of the local, but overall, I think they can kind of make a lot of their own decisions as well.
Yeah, and if you just make sure that all of those workplaces, they cultivate member leaders and stuff like that, so there's always that sort of or in-house organizing going on, right? I think the stories that I hear from the sort of other kind of thing is that they sort of let it go, right? And they don't cultivate member leaders either. So if the rep doesn't show up, there's nobody knows what to do.
Exactly.
But when you have active informed members, it's like, yeah, you can mitigate that somewhat. So now for the elephant in the room, as it were, as 367's upcoming bargaining with the big grocery chains, Safeway, Albertsons, and Kroger. Our contracts with those employers will be coming up for renegotiation soon. We've already talked earlier about some of the issues that members in the stores are facing, most notably the hours cuts and the financial and life planning difficulties that those have brought. Besides that, are there any other topics that you've heard a lot of members say they want to see addressed in the new contract? And, with obviously without revealing too much, what do you think our main objectives will really be in those negotiations?
So we've talked about some of these issues, and what's great about our local union and being member driven and doing all the work that we're doing out in the stores is that we have a real sense of what's foremost on people's minds, right? So we're going to do surveys like we always do. Every contract, you send out surveys, you ask members what's most important to them. Oftentimes it's wages and healthcare and other things that come up, maybe safety. But I can almost guarantee hours, wages, and safety are going to be the three top tier, items that are foremost on people's minds.
Mm-hmm.
And we're already running campaigns around those issues in our stores, not around wages, but around the hours and we're looking at safety now. I think we're also looking at breaks because I have been in some stores recently where members have told me they're not, getting their breaks or working through them because of the short staffing.
Yeah.
And so we're probably going to run a campaign around that. But these member engagement teams are a way for the workers to meet with the rep, meet with organizers, sometimes with me, and talk about all these issues and how we're going to fight. And then we're building muscle for the big fight, and a lot of these member engagement teams will become contract action teams as we get closer to bargaining. And one thing I want to mention, because I don't think we've mentioned this yet, Isaac, is South Sound Rising is the title of the grocery campaign that we're about to launch. I've been using the hashtag South Sound Rising. It's been talked a lot around our union hall, but also out in the membership. And I see it as not just a grocery campaign, but as a platform to raise the standards for all working class people in our jurisdiction. And I think by doing that, members are going to look at us and look at our partners like DSA and want to be part of that. They're going to want to join a union. They're going to want to join a like-minded group such as DSA. And if you look at, we're going to build out a website on this, but if you were to go to the website, you would see the contract campaign and everything around that. You would see the organizing school, the worker bill of rights, even the tenant rights. And for that would simply be links to like Olympia for All, Tacoma for All, maybe Firelands down in Grays Harbor, which are doing great work around tenant protections. But it's going to be a much bigger campaign than just a grocery fight. And ultimately, the goal is to be strike ready. And one thing I'll say specifically to your listeners is that I think the best way for DSA, because DSA can sometimes be looked upon as a fringe sort of organization, right? Some people have different perceptions of DSA. Yeah. I have a good one, and I'm a member of DSA. Actually, I should have probably said that earlier.
Oh, nice.
I'm a member of Tacoma DSA, but I think the best way for DSA to win the hearts and minds of all workers in South Puget Sound is to show up on the picket lines.
For sure.
I've seen what can happen when the Chicago teachers went out on strike and DSA helped stock those picket lines. Whenever a line was down, that strike ready line comes in handy because then they can get people to show up where it's sort of sparse. And I think together we can just do some really cool stuff. And this grocery campaign should be exciting for anyone, regardless of whether you work in a grocery store or not.
Yeah, and what do you see as the main difficulties we'll face in that bargaining, or what obstacles do you really see the employers trying to set up for us?
They're going to try and divide us by county.
Mm.
I think they're going to follow through on the threats from last time because they're not happy with us because we've won a lot of fights with them. We've won a lot of grievances, which we haven't even talked about. And I probably wouldn't even be able to talk about because I don't work in the grievance department. I see that sort of off to the side. But there's just been a lot of wins that this local has had against these employers, and they are not happy. They're not happy that the Fred Meyer GM units were organized. They're not happy about the inroads we made on safety. They see all the political work that we're doing around worker retention and fighting the merger. And so they're going to try to make an example out of us. And, it's in everyone's best interest that we all stand together and fight them on this because, people are mad right now. A lot of people in our membership are upset with the current administration because the cost of milk and the cost of gas. It's not, regardless of what you think about Joe Biden is not the result or the cause of your pain. It's corporate greed. They're the ones raising gas prices, raising the cost of milk, taking advantage of a pandemic, and inflicting pain on the working class. And so, it's time for us to stand up against them. And we may not be able to do it on a national level every time, but we can definitely do it in the 6 counties that we represent.
Right. And the more we win at this level, I think the more it inspires people elsewhere to launch other struggles that can converge into something larger.
Right.
So I wanted to end the show on kind of a fun, positive note by talking about our 367's recent plans to purchase a building that can serve as like a proper union hall. Up until now, the local has had an office in South Tacoma, kind of Lakewood area that has functioned really well as an administrative center, but it didn't, have the like a big auditorium space where you could have like big membership meetings, right? How do you kind of, where do things stand with that? First of all, it's not a done deal yet. But how do you potentially see that new hall as helping kind of create a space for solidarity and establishing the union as a community?
Yeah, so I know I mentioned the organizing school was probably the thing I'm most excited about. I guess I lied because this actually is even more exciting. And we are in the process right now of signing a purchase and sale agreement. Now that does not make it a done deal. We have to do our due diligence. This isn't like buying a house. It's 3 times the cost, right? And 3 times the size. So we have to be very diligent on the feasibility study. We put together a team that includes a real estate attorney, a broker, an architecture firm, and we're currently in the process of hiring an environmental specialist, not to mention doing the usual assessments of the building and all of that. But Isaac, this has the potential it's downtown Tacoma. It's in a great location that's going to go up in value. It's an old fire station that was built in 1911, but it's in beautiful condition. And next to it is right now it's a warehouse that's 8,000 square feet that if this deal goes through and everything works out, we want to turn into a 500 plus seat auditorium where we can do steward conferences and huge meetings and contract votes. And we can also rent that out to other organizations that want to do that. There's room to build a kitchen to do the meat apprenticeship training on site.
Ooh.
There's lots of space in the building. The office building itself, the old fire station, has 2 floors. There's a basement that we can build out an entire war room out of and do much bigger planning, or build a couple war rooms down there so that we can run multiple campaign planning. And then there's the second floor, which is beautiful, and it's got a rooftop deck. It's one really good thing about this too is, so right now we're in an office that's about 6,000 square feet. This would automatically give us more space, obviously, but also there's tenants in this building, and like the first floor, there's a number of suites. We would take over the entire second floor immediately, but we would rent out a couple of the suites downstairs, and they already have tenants, and that can bring in income So it gives us more space. It gives us room to grow. And as we're growing, we have income coming in. So it's just a great investment overall. And I think the members are going to be really excited if this does go through.
Yeah. And I of course, am of the opinion that like every union should have a proper hall. We need to bring that back.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think our building has served a purpose for a long time, but it's frustrating that we can't hold big meetings. And there's been many times when we're tripping over ourselves because we have multiple things going on in the office, and it can be a logistical nightmare to try to move things around.
Oh, for sure. Well, Mike Hines, it's been great talking with you again. Thank you for joining us today. Did you have any last thoughts you want to share with the audience, or anything else folks should know about?
I don't know. That's a lot that we talked about.
It was, yeah.
I think that covers it all. I would just encourage your listeners to get involved, to get more involved if they're not already with Olympia DSA, and also to support this fight that's coming up. I just think we can all do great work together on the South Sound Rising campaign.
All right. And listeners, be sure to check the show notes for links related to some of the topics we discussed today, including the details of the new tenant protections in Olympia, registration for the Workers' Rights Summit, links to some of those bills from the legislature that we discussed earlier. Mike Hines, thanks again, and thank you to everyone for listening. Solidarity forever.
Thanks, Isaac. I appreciate it.
Take care.
You too.